Welcome to how to read knitting patterns, charts, and skein labels. During this video, I'll provide you with information on how to read knitting patterns from left to right and labels that are included with every skein of yarn you purchase. Just as we use instructions called recipes for cooking special food like cakes, we can make garments from knitting patterns that resemble a cake recipe. The ingredients and tools of a recipe would be called the materials of a knitting pattern. Knitting patterns also have finishing instructions that include edges and trimmings like that of a cake recipe with frosting as a finishing touch. You will notice that this fluffy cake recipe not only are the instructions, tools, ingredients, and finishing listed, but also what level of difficulty the recipe is. The picture on the right even includes some problems the novice cook may run into while baking the cake from scratch. Next, we'll look at a simple knitting pattern and notice the similarities between a cake recipe to that of a knitting pattern. Last but not least, notice that the ingredients in the recipe include abbreviations that only an experienced cook would be familiar with, such things as C for cup or TSP for teaspoon, etc. So you would need to know what those abbreviations mean in your recipe before you actually start measuring your ingredients. Now we'll look at the knitting pattern of a simple scarf. This pattern from a knitting book does not give you the finished size or the abbreviations defined within it, just like the recipe did not. This is because the instructions state that you can make the scarf as long as you would like, and the abbreviations that you have on it are defined in a separate page of the book, just like the cookbook. You could look on a separate page, usually to find out what your definitions mean. Also, notice that just like a recipe in a cookbook, there's a picture of the finished product. Materials, so what you need to cook with, or it could be the ingredients as well, and needed to produce the cake. And the instructions on a second page, of course we're looking at the knitting pattern now. Your materials are going to include your needle, what type of yarn, might even include the brand of the yarn. And it would also may include the size, like this pattern does. It doesn't always include the size because it may tell you just to, knit as long as you like and then end it. Some scarves will tell you that. And the instructions, and it also includes gauge. But then on the second page, we'll notice that you have the finishing, you have the instructions as well for the scarf, which is very simple. There's just a few steps. Gauge is not used in recipes. We'll never see that in a recipe that I know of. But it is very important for knitting projects for them to come out the size that the pattern calls for. We'll discuss gauge in a minute. Okay, every knitting pattern and skein of yarn purchased has a standard weight number. This is very important too. It's included as part of the description, which indicates the thickness of the yarn that affects the weight of the skein. For example, the number 4 symbol on a skein indicates that the yarn is worsted. So 4 and worsted are synonymous terms and is usually indicated on the pattern with the brand or type of yarn. Type of yarn indicating if it's wool, acrylic, or some other natural fiber. The skein on the yarn will also provide directions in the form of symbols of how to care for the garment once it is completed. Here's an example of a chart, and we have a chart that's going to indicate what each number that is included on every skein of yarn purchased indicates for examples of items produced. So whatever you produce out of the skein, this is what you're going to need to do to care for that item that you produced. The skein will also include the gauge range and stockinette stitch. Pay attention to what the gauge calls for and what stitch is being used to produce that gauge or that number of stitches. And recommended for needle size, it's going to have the needle size also on the skein for each weight of yarn. Notice that the heavier and thicker the yarn is, the thicker or larger the needle required to knit the garment is. Knitting patterns will include yarn type and weight, brand, and needle size recommended for use with the yarn that you purchased. Okay, here is a yarn skein label. This one is one of the simplest I have ever seen. I haven't been knitting very long, but this one is super simple as far as what it has on the skein. It tells you that the type of yarn is Quiviot, I believe, 100%. And the weight of the skein is 2 ounces, only 2 ounces if it's a very small skein. And the yardage of the yarn, which is 120 yards. The care symbols would be placed in another area of the skein, probably on the other side of the skein. Universal care symbols are being used to reduce language on yarn and clothing labels. These symbols indicate how best to care for an item that could be made from the yarn that you purchased. When giving a hand-knitted or crocheted item as a gift, it's so helpful to include a label from a ball or skein of yarn used for the project so that the recipient will know how to care for the item. There's additional helpful care information accompanying each symbol also that's included on the skein. For instance, inside the washing symbol, there might be a suggested water temperature or hand dipping in the tub to indicate hand washing. Or a big X on the symbol indicates do not do whatever that symbol indicates. We'll look at those particular pictures on the next slide. Okay, here's your yarn care symbols. Include any of them that have an X already stated, indicate that the finished garment should not be, it might indicate that the garment should not be washed, like the first X item on the first column indicates that this item, if you had this on your skein, the item that you produced would not want you to wash it in a washing machine. Drying natural care labels also may indicate something about drying. On the right side of this example, you'll see there's an X over it. It's do not dry clean. So if you produced a item from this skein that you purchased, then you would not want to dry clean it. Drying natural fibers in a dryer can ruin the garment. I've washed and dried many garments made of rayon, for instance, and ended up with a garment made to fit a child. Okay, I want to point out one other symbol on here is under the drying section on the bottom. There's an X over the do not tumble dry. That means you don't put it in the dryer. And with a lot of knitted garments, especially those made of natural fibers, you do not want to tumble dry them. You just want to lay them, it'll say lay flat or something like that as far as drying the garment. As a beginning knitter, we're going to move on to abbreviations. It's important to not overwhelm yourself with the over 100 abbreviations used in knitting. Instead, it's recommended for the beginning knitter to just learn as you go and start with simple projects like baby booties, baby blankets, wash rags, oven mitts, or even drink coasters. I have listed some of the abbreviations commonly used and to be learned with our first knitting project. We're going to start on baby booties. Okay, our abbreviations would be cast on, CO for cast on. It's your very first row of stitches that you cast onto your needle. And we'll just be producing the garter stitch, which means you're knitting every row and you're only knitting abbreviations. We just went over cast on, and then we have K For the knit stitch, we only use the knit stitch for every row, and every row is going to produce the garter stitch when you knit on every row. And then we have BO for binding off or ending your project. Now, part of this project that we're going to work on, we're going to be binding off in the middle of the project and also at the end. So it may just mean that you're getting rid of some of your stitches at some point, either the middle or the end. BO for bind off. Gauge is defined and explained in a nutshell. The number of stitches per inch and the number of rows per inch that result from a specified yarn worked with needles in a specified size. So within your pattern, it will call for a specific type of yarn, such as like a number 4 worsted yarn possibly, and needles that are specified size. So you may be using typically number 4, you can use a number 8 needle. It can be other sizes of needles as well, but it'll either be a number 8 or it'll indicate the millimeters for the needle that you need to use with that yarn. That'll be all within your pattern. Okay, you'll have a gauge in your pattern. You'll make a gauge swatch according to what your pattern calls for. Your pattern may call for a stockinette stitch gauge, which means you knit 1 row and you purl 1 row, and you knit 1 row and you purl 1 row to produce a stockinette stitch gauge. It is a 4-inch square, so you'd make it 4 inches, both directions. And this way you can measure vertically and horizontally per inch of knitted fabric how many stitches you have going across in an inch and how many stitches you have going up and down within an inch. And this is your gauge. Okay, so you may count, I don't know, let's say 5 stitches going across in an inch. Within an inch, you can use a ruler. And you may have, I don't know, 6 to 8 stitches, maybe let's say 6 stitches going up and down. Then you would measure your, within an inch, how many stitches you stitched going up and down. All right. The reason we measure gauge is because everyone knits differently, some loosely, some tightly, and some in between. The measurements of an individual's work will vary greatly, even when knitters use the exact same pattern and the exact same size and yarn and needle. So this would be for something like a sock or a shirt. You want it to fit properly according to what your pattern calls for and what size you're knitting for. So the next slide is going to tell us how in the world are we going to fix the gauge if it's not coming out the same as what the pattern calls for. In general, if you end up with more stitches or rows per inch than specified, you're going to make another swatch with larger size needles. So let's say the swatch called for 6 going across and 8 going up and down, and you had 8 going across and 10 going up and down. So you want to use a larger needle so that your gauge should match your pattern. If you have fewer stitches or rows per inch than specified, make another swatch with a size smaller needles. So basically your stitches are bigger than what the gauge is calling for, then you can lower your needle size down. Let's say you'd go from an 8 to a 7. That would be to decrease the size of your stitches to match the gauge that your pattern calls for. Here's our pattern in our first project that we're going to go over. Okay, how exciting. Anyway, we'll be using medium weight yarn, which is also called worsted weight, and it has a number 4 on the skein, so you know you're using the right weight of yarn. Your needles should be size 8, US size 8 straight needles. The sizes that we'll be able to knit, and you need to choose your size from the very beginning of your pattern, could be for a newborn, a 3-month-old baby, a 6-month-old baby, or a 9-month-old baby. Okay, so make up your mind from the very beginning of your pattern what you think the size is that you want to knit for, and you want to stick with that. So let's say we go for, let's use a newborn as our example. We want to just make some newborn baby booties. All right, we're going to continue with our pattern here. It states cast on 26 in parentheses 30, and the commas mean or 34 or 38 stitches. If you're knitting a newborn baby booty, you would only cast on 26 stitches. Let's say you wanted the booties to fit a 3-month-old, then you'd cast on 30 stitches. For a 6-month-old, 34 stitches, or for a 9-month-old would be 38 stitches. We're going for a newborn, so we'd only cast on 26 stitches. Okay, the next step after we get the cast on done and we cast on that first row of stitches, it tells us right after casting on 26, 30, 34, or 38 stitches, we're going to work and garter stitch, which is our knit stitch, back and forth for 10. We're doing a newborn, 10 rows. So we knit 10 rows of using knit stitch to make the garter stitch. Okay, we're knitting so that we're producing a garter stitch, and we're knitting 10 rows back and forth, one way, and then another would be row 2 the other way, and so forth. And then the tricky part about this pattern would be after we knit those 10 rows, we're doing the newborn right here. BO is bind off. We're binding off 10 stitches at the beginning of the next row, and then we're finishing that row. So we're going to bind off 10 stitches at the end. So we're starting the beginning, the bottom part of the top part of our T. Okay. And then it tells us the next step is we're on the next row, and then we're going to bind off 10. We're doing the newborn booty stitches at the beginning of the next row. So we're wrapping up or binding off, eliminating 10 stitches on the next row. This leaves you with 6 stitches in the middle to make your T shape that you're making for the baby booty. Okay, so now you're going to be knitting with only 6 stitches in the middle because you've eliminated 10 stitches on each side of your work. The garter stitch, you use the garter stitch to knit the remaining stitches for 10 rows. Okay, so you produce 10 more rows in the garter stitch. All right, the final piece should now take on the shape of the letter T. At the right and left sides of the T shape should be placed on the footbed, so and the bottom, which is the bottom part of the T shape. Sew all 3 layers together and turn inside out when finished. You also want to remember that you're binding off at the bottom of the T shape, and that's completely binding off your work or ending your work. Here's what your piece should look like when you're done. You'll notice you'll have a little strand of yarn at the top, and you'll have a little strand of yarn on the bottom that you can weave into your work. And that would be another lesson. It's not difficult to do. If you've ever done sewing, it's basically sewing in your loose strands into the material that you made. Okay. And then you take, so your final piece would look like this. You take both sides of your T, lap them over the bottom part of the T, sew that together, and then turn it, that would be wrong side, then you turn it right side out to produce your final piece or your final booty. All right, so our next lesson, we're going to learn or review casting on stitches to begin the project. We're going to learn how to produce the garter stitch, make sure we're doing that correctly, and we're going to learn how to bind off in the middle of our work and at the end of our work. Have fun!